Who decided how Germany would be divided after World War II? It is one of the most consequential questions in modern history, a question whose answer shaped not just the fate of one nation, but the destiny of an entire continent for nearly half a century. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were rubble, its armies destroyed, its government dissolved, and into that vacuum stepped four powers, each with their own vision of what Germany should become, each willing to fight politically, diplomatically, and eventually through proxy for control over the most strategically vital territory in Europe. The decisions made around conference tables in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, in the offices of the European Advisory Commission, in the corridors of the White House and the Kremlin and Downing Street, would determine not just how Germany was carved up, but whether Europe itself would find peace or slide into a new kind of conflict. And in this video, we will find out exactly who those decision makers were, what motivated them, what they agreed upon, where they disagreed, and how those agreements and disagreements ultimately produced two entirely different German states that would face each other across a heavily fortified border for more than 4 decades. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning of this remarkable and complex story. To understand how Germany came to be divided, you have to go back further than most people realize. The idea that Germany would need to be dismembered, occupied, or fundamentally reshaped after the war didn't emerge in 1945. It did not even emerge in 1944. The seeds of division were planted years earlier as Allied leaders began to grapple with a question that seemed almost too enormous to answer. What do you do with a nation of 80 million people that has twice in a generation plunged the world into catastrophic war? This was not a simple military question. It was a philosophical, geopolitical, and deeply personal question for every leader who sat down to consider it. And the answers they arrived at reflected not just their strategic calculations, but their ideologies, their fears, their ambitions, and their understanding of history. To tell this story properly, we need to understand the individuals who drove these decisions, the conferences where the key choices were made, and the forces that ultimately tore apart whatever agreement those men thought they had reached, because the division of Germany was not planned as a permanent outcome. It emerged from the collapse of an alliance that had always been fragile, an alliance held together by the shared necessity of defeating Adolf Hitler and nothing more. The first figure we must understand is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States and the dominant Western voice in shaping Allied policy during most of the war. Roosevelt was born in 1882 into a wealthy New York family, educated at Harvard and Columbia Law School, and had entered politics with the kind of effortless confidence that came from a life of privilege and intellectual self-assurance. His political career had been interrupted by a devastating bout of poliomyelitis in 1921, which paralyzed him from the waist down and would confine him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. But rather than destroying him, the illness seemed to deepen his empathy and his determination. He went on to win the presidency 4 times, a record that will almost certainly never be broken, and steered the United States through both the Great Depression and the Second World War. By the time the question of Germany's fate was being seriously discussed, Roosevelt was aging, visibly exhausted, and suffering from a range of serious health conditions that those around him could see even if the public could not. His blood pressure was dangerously elevated, his heart was weakened, and the man who had once projected such vigorous leadership was increasingly relying on a small circle of trusted advisors to help him process the complexity of the decisions before him. Yet his instincts remained sharp in certain respects. Roosevelt believed deeply, perhaps naively, that he had a personal ability to manage Joseph Stalin, that through charm, flexibility, and direct engagement, he could bring the Soviet leader into a stable post-war order. He was convinced that the greatest danger to post-war peace was not Soviet expansion, but a resurgent Germany, and that preventing German militarism from rising a third time was worth almost any political concession to Moscow. These convictions would shape every major decision he made about Germany's future. Roosevelt's vision for post-war Germany was at various points quite radical. In September 1944, he initially endorsed a plan proposed by his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., that would have transformed Germany from an industrial nation into an essentially agricultural one. The Morgenthau Plan, as it became known, called for the complete dismantling of German heavy industry, the flooding of the Ruhr mines, the elimination of Germany's capacity to ever again wage industrial warfare, and the partitioning of German territory into smaller states. Morgenthau, a close personal friend of Roosevelt, had developed this plan with passionate conviction. He argued that only by stripping Germany of its industrial base could the world be protected from a third German war. The plan went so far as to suggest that the entire Ruhr region, the industrial heartland of Germany, should be placed under international control and its economic infrastructure permanently disabled. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill both initialed the Morgenthau Plan at the Second Quebec Conference in September 1944, a decision that would later cause considerable embarrassment to both men when its contents were leaked to the press. The public reaction in the United States and Britain was largely negative. Critics argued that a devastated, impoverished Germany in the heart of Europe would create exactly the conditions of resentment and desperation that had brought Hitler to power in the first place. Henry Stimson, Roosevelt's Secretary of War, argued strenuously against the plan, warning that it would leave a power vacuum in Central Europe that could only benefit the Soviet Union. The plan was quietly shelved, but its existence tells us something important about the atmosphere of 1944 and 1945. There were serious, powerful people in Allied governments who believed that the only safe Germany was a destroyed Germany, and that belief cast a long shadow over every subsequent negotiation. Henry Morgenthau Jr. himself deserves a moment of our attention, because his role in these discussions was more significant than most histories acknowledge. Born in New York City in 1891 to a family that had emigrated from Germany, Morgenthau had grown up with a deep ambivalence about German culture and politics. His father had been a wealthy real estate investor and diplomat, and Henry Jr. had inherited both his father's business instincts and his commitment to public service. He had become a close friend of Franklin Roosevelt during the 1920s, when both men were neighbors in Dutchess County, New York, and when Roosevelt became president, Morgenthau followed him to Washington. As Treasury Secretary from 1934 to 1945, Morgenthau wielded enormous influence, not just over economic policy, but over a wide range of wartime decisions. His plan for Germany reflected a genuine conviction, shared by many Jewish Americans of his generation, that the German people had demonstrated a unique and dangerous capacity for militarism and anti-Semitic violence that could not simply be reformed away. He believed that only by making Germany economically incapable of waging war could future generations be protected. The abandonment of his plan did not end Morgenthau's influence. He continued to argue for tough treatment of Germany throughout 1944 and into 1945, and his voice remained one of the most hawkish in Roosevelt's inner circle. He resigned from his position in July 1945, shortly after Roosevelt's death, and spent the rest of his life as a committed Zionist fundraiser and activist. He died in 1967 at the age of 75, having lived long enough to see Germany divided, though not in the way he had envisioned. The man who would replace Roosevelt at the most critical moment of these negotiations was Harry S. Truman, and understanding Truman is essential to understanding why the Potsdam Conference unfolded the way it did. Truman was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, the son of a mule trader, and he grew up in circumstances vastly different from Roosevelt's patrician world. He had worked as a bank clerk, a farmer, and a haberdasher before entering politics in Missouri in the 1920s, under the patronage of the notorious Kansas City political boss Tom Pendergast. Despite this somewhat compromised beginning, Truman had proven himself a capable and courageous senator, chairing a committee that investigated waste and fraud in wartime military contracts and saving the American taxpayer billions of dollars in the process. He had been added to the Democratic ticket in 1944, primarily because party bosses wanted to replace the incumbent vice president, Henry Wallace, whom they considered too left-wing and too friendly toward the Soviet Union. Truman was seen as a safe, reliable Middle American choice. He was also, as it turned out, someone Roosevelt had barely consulted, and certainly had not briefed on the most sensitive aspects of Allied diplomacy. When Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945, at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, Truman was called to the White House and told that he was now the most powerful man in the world. He reportedly told reporters afterward that he felt as though the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. He was not exaggerating. The Manhattan Project, The secret development of the atomic bomb had been kept from him. The details of the agreements reached at Yalta were only partially known to him. The personalities and positions of America's allies and enemies were largely unfamiliar territory. He would have less than 3 months to prepare before meeting Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam, and the decisions made there would define the post-war world. Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime Prime Minister, was in many ways the most complicated of the 3 major Allied leaders when it came to the question of Germany's future. Churchill had been warning about the dangers of German militarism since before the First World War, and his campaign against appeasement in the 1930s had made him the most prescient voice in British politics. Yet Churchill's attitude toward Germany after victory was more nuanced than simple vengeance. He was, at heart, a 19th-century imperialist who thought in terms of balance of power and spheres of influence, and his primary concern as the war moved toward its conclusion was not so much what happened to Germany as what happened to the Soviet Union's relationship with Western Europe. Churchill had been the first Allied leader to clearly articulate his concerns about Soviet expansionism. In October 1944, during his visit to Moscow, he had famously proposed what became known as the Percentages Agreement, a remarkably frank division of Balkan influence in which he slid a piece of paper across the table to Stalin, suggesting that Romania would be 90% in the Soviet sphere, Greece would be 90% British, Yugoslavia and Hungary would be split 50-50, and Bulgaria would be 75% Soviet. Stalin, reportedly, put a large tick on the paper with a blue pencil and slid it back. Churchill immediately felt uneasy about what he had done, writing in his memoirs that it seemed terrible that the fates of millions should be decided in such an offhand fashion, though he had been the one to propose it. Churchill's approach to Germany reflected this same pragmatic great power calculus. He wanted a Germany that was disarmed and unable to threaten Britain again, but he also wanted a Germany that was not so destroyed and impoverished that it became a Soviet satellite by default. He was increasingly worried, as early as 1944, and certainly by early 1945, that the Soviet Union posed a greater long-term threat to Western European stability than a defeated Germany ever would. These concerns put him at odds with Roosevelt, who believed that Stalin could be managed, and they gave a particular urgency and tension to every conference discussion about Germany's future. Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, the ancestral home of the Dukes of Marlborough, into one of the most aristocratic families in England. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had been a brilliant, but erratic conservative politician who had risen to become Chancellor of the Exchequer before a mysterious illness, almost certainly syphilis, ended his career and his life. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American beauty who gave Churchill his transatlantic connections and his restless energy. Churchill had spent his young adulthood as a soldier and a journalist, participating in military campaigns in Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa, and writing about them with a vivid self-promotional flair that launched his political career. By the time he became Prime Minister in May 1940, he was 65 years old and had already lived multiple lives: soldier, journalist, novelist, historian, Chancellor, Home Secretary, First Lord of the Admiralty, and long-time political wilderness wanderer. His wartime leadership had been extraordinary, his speeches having genuinely helped hold Britain together during the darkest days of 1940 and 1941. But his grip on power was not secure. The British electorate was exhausted, and in July 1945, in the middle of the Potsdam Conference itself, British voters delivered a stunning verdict. They threw Churchill out of office in a landslide election victory for the Labour Party. Churchill left Potsdam before it was finished, replaced by the new Labour Prime Minister, Clement Atlee, who had actually been at Potsdam as part of the British delegation from the beginning. This mid-conference change of government was an extraordinary and unprecedented event in diplomatic history, and it left the British negotiating position in a somewhat uncertain state at a crucial moment in the discussions. Clement Atlee, who stepped into Churchill's place at Potsdam, was in almost every respect Churchill's opposite. Where Churchill was flamboyant, Atlee was understated to the point of seeming colourless. Churchill could hold a room with a single sentence. Atlee was famously described as a modest man with much to be modest about, though that characterization, often attributed to Churchill himself, was deeply unfair. Atlee was born in 1883 into a solidly upper-middle-class London family and had been educated at Oxford, but his political consciousness had been transformed by his work as a social worker in the East End of London, where he had witnessed the grinding poverty that Victorian capitalism had produced. He had fought with distinction in the First World War at Gallipoli and in Mesopotamia, and had entered Labour politics afterward with a quiet but steely conviction that the British working class deserved better than they had been given. As Prime Minister, Atlee would go on to establish the National Health Service, nationalise key industries and grant independence to India, achievements that many historians now regard as among the most significant of any 20th century British government. At Potsdam, however, he was a new arrival in the middle of complex negotiations, and his influence on the specific decisions about Germany's division was limited by the advanced state of discussions that had already taken place. Nevertheless, he brought continuity to the British position on the key questions, and his presence ensured that Britain's voice, however diminished, continued to be heard. The figure who loomed over all of these discussions, who shaped the eventual outcome perhaps more than any other single individual, was Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the absolute dictator of the world's largest country. Stalin's life story reads like something from a particularly grim 19th century novel. Born in 1878 in Gori, a small town in the Russian-controlled territory of Georgia, to a cobbler father and a pious mother, Yosef Yugashvili, as he was then known, had grown up in conditions of real poverty and frequent violence. His father was a heavy drinker who beat him regularly. The young Yugashvili had shown academic promise and won a scholarship to a Georgian Orthodox seminary in Tiflis, but he had been expelled for revolutionary activities and had thrown himself into the underground world of Bolshevik politics. He had adopted the name Stalin, meaning man of steel, and had proven himself willing to use real steel against his enemies. He had spent years in Siberian exile, had robbed banks to fund the revolutionary cause, had participated in the revolution of 1917, and had eventually outmaneuvered all his rivals to seize complete control of the Soviet state after Lenin's death. His consolidation of power in the late 1920s and 1930s had come at a cost measured in millions of lives. Forced collectivization had killed several million Soviet peasants, the Gulag system had enslaved tens of millions more, and the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 had executed or imprisoned virtually the entire old Bolshevik leadership, along with hundreds of thousands of military officers, party officials, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, whose loyalty Stalin suspected. By the time the Second World War ended, Stalin was ruler of a country that had suffered perhaps 27 million deaths in the conflict, a loss so staggering that it coloured every decision he made about what Germany's defeat should mean for Soviet security. Stalin's position on Germany was shaped above all by this overwhelming experience of loss and by his determination that the Soviet Union would never again be vulnerable to a German attack. He wanted reparations on a massive scale to help rebuild the shattered Soviet economy. He wanted buffer states between Germany and the Soviet heartland. He wanted a Germany that was either controlled by a friendly communist government or permanently weakened to the point where it could never again threaten Soviet territory. He was also, as those who negotiated with him came to appreciate, a man of extraordinary tactical intelligence and enormous patience. He did not bluster or threaten in negotiations. He was quiet, methodical, and possessed of a memory for detail that unnerved his counterparts. He had a gift for identifying the specific vulnerability of each opponent and applying precisely calibrated pressure. Roosevelt, who believed he could charm Stalin into cooperation, consistently underestimated him. Churchill, who understood power more clearly, was at least appropriately cautious. Truman, meeting him for the first time at Potsdam, came away with a mixed impression, simultaneously impressed by Stalin's directness and deeply suspicious of his intentions. Whether the Cold War that followed was inevitable, whether a different approach by Western leaders might have produced a different outcome, remains one of the most debated questions in modern history. What is not debatable is that Stalin's decisions about what he wanted from a defeated Germany and his willingness to pursue those goals through any means available were the single most important factor in driving the eventual division of the country. Before any of these leaders met at Yalta or Potsdam, the formal groundwork for Germany's occupation and division was being laid by a body that most people have never heard of, the European Advisory Commission. Established in October 1943 following the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers, the EAC, as it was known, was tasked with studying European problems arising from the conduct of the war and making recommendations to the three Allied governments. Its membership was limited to representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, with France joining later. The EAC met in London at Lancaster House, one of the grandest of the capital's government buildings, and its deliberations, though largely invisible to the public, were of enormous practical consequence. It was the EAC that produced the specific documents defining Germany's occupation zones and the terms of Germany's surrender. The American representative on the EAC was John G. Wynant, the US ambassador to Britain, a tall, somewhat reserved New Englander who had previously served as governor of New Hampshire. Wynant was a committed internationalist who believed deeply in the possibility of Allied cooperation, and he worked hard to find common ground with his Soviet counterpart. The British representative was Sir William Strang, a career diplomat who had joined the Foreign Office in 1919 and had decades of experience in European affairs. The Soviet representative was Fedor Gusev, the Soviet ambassador to Britain, who worked under strict instructions from Moscow and had limited room for independent initiative. France was represented from late 1944 by René Massily, the diplomat who had served as Charles de Gaulle's representative in Algiers and who was determined to ensure that France, despite its occupation and collaboration during the war years, secured a meaningful place in post-war European arrangements. The EAC's work on the German occupation zones began in earnest in early 1944, and the document it eventually produced, the Agreement on Control Machinery in Germany, signed on November 14, 1944, defined with considerable precision how Germany was to be administered after defeat. The core principle was straightforward. Germany would be divided into occupation zones, with each Allied power responsible for administering its own zone, while a joint Allied Control Council in Berlin would handle matters affecting Germany as a whole. The boundaries of the zones were drawn based on a British proposal initially developed by a committee chaired by Clement Atlee, who was then serving as Deputy Prime Minister and chair of the Cabinet Committee on Armistice Terms and Civil Administration. This is a detail worth pausing on, because it means that the man who would eventually represent Britain at Potsdam had himself been involved in drawing the map of occupation zones that would be discussed there. The British proposal divided Germany roughly into thirds: the Soviet zone in the east, the British zone in the northwest, and the American zone in the south. Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, would be treated as a separate territory jointly occupied by all three powers, a decision with enormous long-term consequences that nobody at the time fully appreciated. The French were not yet involved in EAC discussions when these initial proposals were made, but it was understood that they would eventually receive a zone carved from the British and American areas. The specific boundaries of what became the French zone would be determined later, at Yalta, and in subsequent negotiations. The Tehran Conference of November and December 1943 had been the first summit meeting of the three major Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, and while its primary focus was military strategy rather than post-war planning, it provided an important preview of how the Big Three would interact when Germany's fate was at stake. The conference was held in the Soviet embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran, a location chosen partly for Stalin's convenience and partly because Allied intelligence had warned of a possible German assassination plot targeting all three leaders. Roosevelt, despite his deteriorating health, had made the long and arduous journey from Washington, stopping in Cairo for preliminary discussions with Churchill and with Chiang Kai-shek of China. The Cairo Conference, which preceded Tehran, had produced the Cairo Declaration regarding Japan, but it had also given Roosevelt and Churchill a chance to coordinate their approach to dealing with Stalin. That coordination was, to put it mildly, imperfect. The two Western leaders had quite different priorities, and Roosevelt had made a deliberate tactical choice to distance himself from Churchill in Stalin's presence, apparently believing that demonstrating American independence from British imperialism would make him more effective in building a personal relationship with the Soviet leader. Stalin, for his part, played the two Western leaders with considerable skill, engaging Roosevelt in bilateral conversations that flattered the American president while subtly marginalizing Churchill. At Tehran, the question of Germany's post-war fate was discussed in general terms rather than specifics. Roosevelt proposed dividing Germany into 5 autonomous states, plus 2 internationally controlled territories covering the Ruhr and the Kiel Canal area. Churchill suggested a different partition scheme, separating Prussia from a southern German confederation. Stalin was less interested in the specific geography of division than in ensuring that any post-war Germany would be permanently weakened and could not again threaten the Soviet Union. He listened to the Western proposals with interest but committed to nothing specific. What emerged from Tehran was less a concrete plan than a shared conviction among the three leaders that Germany would need to be divided in some fashion and occupied for an extended period after the war. The specifics would be left to lower-level officials, the European Advisory Commission foremost among them, to work out in the months that followed, but the Tehran discussions established the principle that would guide all subsequent negotiations. Germany's unconditional surrender would be followed by its division into zones of occupation, and the Allied powers would jointly govern the country during a transitional period whose length nobody was yet prepared to specify. The European Advisory Commission had been doing exactly that work throughout 1944, and by the time the Yalta Conference convened in February 1945, the basic framework of German occupation was already in place on paper, even if its details remained to be finalized. The Yalta Conference, held at the Livadia Palace near the Black Sea city of Yalta in Soviet-occupied Crimea, was in many ways the decisive moment in the story of Germany's division. It was here that Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, meeting from February 4th to February 11th, 1945, made the key decisions that shaped the post-war German settlement. The setting was deliberately chosen by Stalin to keep the Western leaders on his territory and to remind them, implicitly, of the enormous military power the Soviet Union was projecting at that moment. Red Army forces were less than 50 miles from Berlin, having swept through Poland and into Germany itself, while Western Allied forces were still recovering from the shock of the Battle of the Bulge and had yet to cross the Rhine. The military balance of power in Europe at that moment strongly favoured the Soviet Union, and Stalin knew it. Roosevelt arrived at Yalta in visibly failing health. Photographs from the conference show a man who looks decades older than his 63 years, his face grey and gaunt, his posture slumped. Those who knew him well were shocked by his deterioration. Admiral William Leahy, his chief of staff, wrote in his diary that the president seemed to have aged tremendously. Despite his frailty, Roosevelt was determined to secure Soviet agreement on the structure of the post-war world, and he was willing to make significant concessions to get it. He needed Soviet participation in the war against Japan, which American military planners still estimated could require years of costly fighting and potentially 1 million American casualties. He wanted Soviet support for his cherished project of a new international organization, the United Nations, which he hoped would provide the framework for lasting peace. And he wanted to resolve the question of Germany in a way that would not create the seeds of future conflict. These goals were not always mutually compatible, and the agreements reached at Yalta reflected the tensions between them. On the question of Germany specifically, Yalta produced several crucial decisions. The conference confirmed that Germany would be divided into occupation zones along the lines proposed by the European Advisory Commission. It was agreed that France would receive an occupation zone carved from the British and American areas, a compromise that had been under discussion for months and that finally gave de Gaulle's government the great power status it craved. The specific borders of the French zone, which would cover the Saarland, the Rhineland and Baden-Württemberg, were left to be finalized in subsequent negotiations. Berlin would remain a jointly occupied city within the Soviet zone, with all four powers having rights of access, though the specific corridors and arrangements for that access were left dangerously vague, an oversight that would come back to haunt the Western Allies 3 years later during the Berlin blockade. The conference also agreed in principle that Germany would pay reparations to the Allied powers, with the Soviet Union pressing strongly for a figure of $20 billion, half of which would go to the USSR. The Americans agreed to use this figure as a basis for discussion, though Churchill, worried about the economic consequences of a Germany stripped bare by reparations, reserved his position. This reparations question, unresolved at Yalta, would become one of the most bitter points of contention at Potsdam, and ultimately one of the primary drivers of Germany's economic and political division. The decisions at Yalta also addressed the broader question of what was called the 4 Ds: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. All three powers agreed that Germany must be completely disarmed, that Nazi institutions and ideology must be abolished, that some form of democratic governance must eventually be established, and that excessive centralization of German power must be avoided. But the agreement on these principles concealed profound disagreements about what each of them meant in practice. Demilitarization was straightforward enough. Germany's armed forces would be dissolved and its military industry dismantled or controlled. Denazification was more complicated. How thoroughly should former Nazi party members be purged from public life? At what level of party membership did complicity become unforgivable? How could you run a country of 80 million people if you excluded everyone who had, under threat of professional ruin or worse, joined the party? Democratization was even more ambiguous. The Soviet Union had its own definition of democracy, one that bore no resemblance to what the Western Allies meant by the word, and decentralization could mean anything from a loose federation of German states to the complete destruction of Germany as a unified political entity. These definitional disagreements were not resolved at Yalta. They were papered over with sufficiently vague language that all parties could sign the declaration while retaining their own interpretations. It was a classic diplomatic compromise, and like most such compromises, it contained within it the seeds of the conflict that would follow. One of the specific decisions at Yalta that had enormous long-term consequences was the agreement on Poland's western border. Stalin was determined to move Poland westward, compensating Poland for the territory in the east that the Soviet Union was absorbing by giving it German territory in the west, specifically the lands east of the Oder and Neisse rivers. The Oder-Neisse line, as it became known, would transfer to Polish administration territory that had been German for centuries, including the cities of Breslau, which the Poles would rename Wrocław, Stettin, which would become Szczecin, and the entire region of Silesia. This meant the forced expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans from their ancestral homes, the largest forced population movement in European history. The Western Allies had serious reservations about this arrangement, both because of the human cost of the expulsions and because of the strategic implications of pushing Poland so far into what had been German territory. Churchill in particular argued that the German stomach could not digest so large a meal, meaning that incorporating so many German territories into Poland would create an unstable Polish state dependent on Soviet protection and resentful of its Western neighbours. But Stalin was immovable on this point, and the Western powers, needing Soviet cooperation on so many other fronts, eventually acquiesced. The final determination of Poland's western border was technically left to a future peace conference, but in practice, the Oder-Neisse line became the reality on the ground as Soviet and Polish forces took possession of the territories in question, and the millions of Germans living there were expelled westward. By some estimates, 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were driven out of Eastern Europe in the years 1944 to 1947 in circumstances of considerable brutality, and the vast majority of them ended up in what would become West Germany, adding enormously to the demographic and economic pressures on the Western occupation zones. Roosevelt left Yalta believing he had achieved a workable framework for post-war cooperation with Stalin. He was wrong, though whether he knew it deep down is impossible to say with certainty, given that he died less than 2 months later. On April 12, 1945, sitting for a portrait in his cottage at Warm Springs, Georgia, he suddenly slumped forward and lost consciousness. He died hours later of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He was 63 years old. The news of his death was greeted with genuine grief by millions of Americans and by many people around the world, but also with no small amount of trepidation about what his successor, the relatively unknown Harry Truman, would make of the complex diplomatic arrangements Roosevelt had left behind. Stalin, according to his interpreter Valentin Bereshkov, was profoundly affected by the news and stood in silence for what seemed a very long time when he was told. Whether his grief was genuine or performative is impossible to know. What is clear is that Roosevelt's death removed from the stage the Western leader most committed to finding common ground with the Soviet Union, and replaced him with a man who, while certainly not looking for conflict, was considerably less inclined toward appeasement and considerably more suspicious of Soviet intentions. The stage was set for Potsdam, and the dynamics there would be very different from what they had been at Yalta. Germany's unconditional surrender came on May 8, 1945, a date that the Western Allies would call Victory in Europe Day, or VA Day. The formal act of military surrender had actually been signed twice, first at Reims, France, on May 7th, in a ceremony that the Soviets protested because they felt it had been conducted by the Western Allies without adequate Soviet participation, and then again in Berlin on May 8th, in a ceremony at the German Military Engineering School in Karlshorst that satisfied Soviet demands for a proper and formal capitulation. The German signatories included Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Wehrmacht Supreme Command, who signed on behalf of the German military with the kind of rigid, ceremonial stiffness that had characterized him throughout his career. Keitel would later be tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and executed by hanging on October 16, 1946. But in those first hours after the surrender, the immediate practical question was not what to do with German war criminals, but what to do with Germany itself. The country lay in ruins, its infrastructure was shattered, its cities bombed to rubble, its economy in total collapse. Millions of people were homeless, hungry, and displaced. And four occupying powers, each with their own agenda and their own vision of what Germany should become, were moving into their respective zones and beginning to impose their authority. The four occupation zones that had been agreed in principle at Yalta and worked out in detail by the European Advisory Commission now became physical realities. The Soviet zone covered eastern Germany, comprising the territories of Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia. It was the largest of the four zones by population and by agricultural output, though less industrialized than some of the western zones. The British zone covered the northwest of Germany, including the heavily industrialized Ruhr Valley, Hamburg, Hanover, and the regions of Schleswig-Holstein and the Rhine province. This zone contained the largest concentration of Germany's industrial capacity and was also the most populous, containing roughly 22 million Germans. The American zone covered the south, including Bavaria, Hesse, and the northern parts of Baden-Württemberg, along with the free city of Bremen in the north, which the Americans insisted on retaining as a port. The French zone was the smallest, covering the Saarland, the Rhineland-Palatinate, and the southern portion of Baden-Württemberg, territories that France had coveted for strategic and economic reasons. Berlin, surrounded on all sides by the Soviet zone, was divided into four sectors corresponding to the four powers, with the Soviet sector in the east and the British, American, and French sectors in the west of the city. The Allied Control Council, based in Berlin, was supposed to be the governing body for Germany as a whole, taking decisions by unanimous vote on matters affecting the entire country. This unanimity requirement was, in retrospect, a fatal flaw in the design of post-war German governance. It meant that any single power could block any collective decision, and as Soviet-Western relations deteriorated over the course of 1945 and 1946, the Allied Control Council became increasingly paralyzed. But in the summer of 1945, as the Potsdam Conference was convening, there was still at least a semblance of hope that the four-power system could work. The Potsdam Conference opened on July 17, 1945, at the Sicilienhof Palace in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin that lay within the Soviet occupation zone. The palace had been built between 1914 and 1917 for Crown Prince Wilhelm, the eldest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II, in the style of an English country house, its red brick facade and Tudor-style architecture an incongruous setting for the summit that would determine the fate of a shattered continent. The choice of location was again Stalin's, and again it put the Western leaders on Soviet-controlled territory, a subtle but constant reminder of who held the military advantage in Europe. Harry Truman arrived for his first major international summit with a combination of confidence and anxiety that he managed for the most part to keep off his face. He was 61 years old, had been president for only 3 months, and was carrying a secret that transformed everything. That morning, July 16th, he had received word that the first test of the atomic bomb had been conducted successfully at Trinity Site in New Mexico. The United States now possessed a weapon of unimaginable destructive power, and Truman was trying to calculate how and when to tell Stalin about it and what effect it would have on the negotiations about to begin. Churchill arrived at Potsdam in a state of deep anxiety about the election results that were being tabulated back in Britain. The votes had been cast on July 5th, but because of the need to collect ballots from servicemen stationed around the world, the count would not be completed until July the 26th. Churchill knew that the election was closer than most of his advisers were telling him, but he could not have anticipated the scale of the labour landslide that was coming. For the first 10 days of the conference, he participated in the discussions with his customary energy and force, pressing his concerns about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe, arguing for more generous treatment of the Western occupation zones, and continuing his long-running dispute with Stalin about the fate of Poland. Then, on July 25th, the conference recessed to allow the British delegation to return home for the election results. Churchill left Potsdam believing he would be back. He was not. The Labour Party had won a crushing majority, and on the evening of July 26th, Churchill drove to Buckingham Palace to submit his resignation to King George VI. The next day, Clement Atlee arrived at Potsdam to take his place, accompanied by the new Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, a former trade union leader of immense personal force and considerable diplomatic skill. The Potsdam Conference, which ran until August 2, 1945, produced the Potsdam Agreement, a document of enormous historical importance that addressed virtually every major question about Germany's immediate future. On reparations, the conference produced a compromise that departed significantly from the Soviet demand for a fixed total. Instead of an agreed overall figure, the four powers would each take reparations from their own occupation zones. In addition, the Soviet Union would receive 15% of the industrial equipment removed from the Western zones in exchange for goods from its own zone, and an additional 10% without any exchange requirement. This zone-based reparations formula had profound consequences. It meant that the Soviet zone was quickly stripped of a large portion of its industrial infrastructure, as Soviet dismantling teams moved through eastern Germany, removing entire factories, railway equipment, and power generation facilities to be shipped east. The Western zones were managed very differently, with the Americans in particular increasingly reluctant to strip German industry in ways that would prevent economic recovery and create a dependent population requiring American financial support. The divergence between the Soviet and Western approaches to reparations was one of the earliest and most visible signs that the four-power framework was already breaking down. On the political future of Germany, the Potsdam Agreement established what became known as the 5 Ds: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, decentralization, and decartelization. The last of these referred to the breakup of the great German industrial conglomerates, the Krupps, the IG Farben, the banks and insurance companies that had financed and supported the Nazi war machine. All 5 objectives were agreed upon in principle, but the agreement was silent on what Germany would look like when these objectives had been achieved. There was no agreed timeline for ending the occupation, no clear definition of what a denazified and democratized Germany would look like institutionally, and no mechanism for resolving disputes between the four powers other than the unanimous vote requirement of the Allied Control Council, which was already proving unworkable. The Potsdam Agreement was, in the words of one American diplomat who helped draft it, less a plan for Germany's future than a catalogue of the things the Allies could agree they didn't want. What they did want, separately and sometimes incompatibly, was a very different matter. One figure who played a crucial but often overlooked role at Potsdam was James Francis Burns, who had been appointed by Truman as his Secretary of State just days before the conference began. Burns was a South Carolina politician of enormous experience and considerable cunning, a former senator, former Supreme Court justice, and the man who had been passed over for the vice presidential nomination in 1944 in favor of Truman himself. He knew it and resented it, at least privately, though he was too professional to let that resentment interfere with his work. Burns had attended the Yalta conference as part of the American delegation and had returned with detailed notes, making him one of the best briefed members of the new administration on the state of Allied negotiations. At Potsdam, he was Truman's chief negotiator on the floor, a role he fulfilled with a combination of hard-headedness and pragmatism that produced the Reparations Compromise and several other key agreements. Burns was born in 1882 in Charleston, South Carolina, and had educated himself largely by working as a court stenographer, reading law in his spare time until he was admitted to the bar. His rise from poverty to the heights of American political life was a remarkable personal achievement, and it gave him a practical, unsentimental approach to politics that served him well in the complex negotiations of Potsdam. After the conference, Burns continued to represent American interests in Germany through his tenure as Secretary of State and his Stuttgart speech of September 6. 1946 was a watershed moment in American policy toward Germany, as we shall see. Truman's relationship with Stalin at Potsdam was, by the standards of great power symmetry, surprisingly businesslike. Truman later wrote that he had liked the Russian premier and had found him straightforward, though he had been under no illusions about the nature of the Soviet system or the difficulty of securing genuine cooperation. The moment that defined the conference for Truman, and that shaped his entire subsequent approach to Soviet relations, came on July 24th, when he walked over to Stalin after the day's session and mentioned, as casually as he could manage, that the United States had successfully tested a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He deliberately used vague language, neither saying atomic nor bomb, wanting to test how much Stalin knew. Stalin, according to Truman's account, showed no special interest and replied merely that he hoped the Americans would make good use of it against the Japanese. Truman came away from this exchange believing that Stalin had not understood what he was being told. He was wrong. Stalin had known about the Manhattan Project through Soviet intelligence for years, and that evening he sent an urgent telegram to his chief physicist, Igor Kurchatov, instructing him to accelerate the Soviet atomic bomb program with maximum urgency. The atomic monopoly that Truman thought he possessed was, in Soviet intentions at least, already targeted for elimination. The arms race that would define the Cold War was beginning even as the Potsdam Conference was reaching its conclusions. The question that haunts any serious analysis of the Potsdam Conference is whether a different outcome was possible, whether more flexible or more forceful, Western negotiating could have produced a German settlement that would have avoided the eventual division of the country into two hostile states. Some historians argue that Roosevelt's excessive concessions at Yalta had already made division inevitable by the time Potsdam convened, that the Soviet grip on Eastern Germany was too firm, and Stalin's determination to maintain it too strong for any negotiated solution to have altered the fundamental reality. Others argue that a tougher Western stance at Potsdam, a willingness to withhold economic assistance to the Soviet Union or to use the atomic monopoly as leverage, might have extracted Soviet concessions on Germany that could have preserved some version of unified four-power governance. The truth is probably that division was not inevitable in 1945, but it became increasingly so over the following 2 years as Soviet-Western relations collapsed under the weight of incompatible ideological systems, conflicting strategic interests, and a deep mutual mistrust that no amount of diplomacy could fully overcome. The men at Potsdam were not simply bad diplomats or short-sighted politicians. They were leaders of fundamentally different systems, trying to manage the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, and the miracle, perhaps, is not that they failed to agree, but that they managed to agree on as much as they did. Among the many decisions that shaped Germany's future in the immediate post-war period, the question of what to do about the German people themselves, their government, their administration, their economic organization, was handled very differently in the different occupation zones, and these differences very quickly became apparent. In the Soviet zone, a small group of German communist exiles who had spent the war years in Moscow were flown in to begin building the political and administrative structures that the Soviets intended to establish. The most important of these was Walter Ulbricht, a 52-year-old apparatchik who had been born in Leipzig, had joined the Communist Party of Germany in its early years, and had spent most of the Nazi period in Soviet exile. Ulbricht was not a charismatic figure. He was bureaucratic, methodical, and thoroughly Stalinist in his political orientation. He had learned to survive in Stalin's Moscow, which required an almost inhuman capacity for self-subordination and ideological flexibility, and he brought those qualities to the task of building a communist Germany. Arriving in the Soviet zone in late April 1945, before the fighting had even stopped, Ulbricht and his small group of colleagues, known as the Ulbricht Group, set about systematically placing communist sympathizers or reliable fellow travelers in key administrative positions in Berlin and the surrounding areas. The nominally coalition character of the early Soviet zone administrations was largely illusory. The strategic positions, police chiefs, personnel officers, radio administrators, were filled by Ulbricht's people, while non-communist politicians were given prominent but largely ceremonial roles that gave them little real power. In the Western zones, the approach was different, but not without its own problems and contradictions. The Americans had prepared extensively for the occupation, with thousands of military government officers trained in specialized schools at places like Charlottesville, Virginia, where they had studied German law, administration, and culture. The British had similar preparations, Both powers were committed to denazification, but they discovered very quickly that denazifying Germany thoroughly would mean removing virtually the entire educated professional class, lawyers, doctors, teachers, engineers, administrators, from their positions, because the Nazi Party had penetrated so deeply into professional and civic life. The Nuremberg laws and the political pressures of the Nazi era had made party membership effectively compulsory for anyone who wanted to advance professionally. This created an impossible dilemma. Do you govern Germany with incompetent people who had avoided the party, or do you govern it with capable people who had joined the party to survive? In practice, both the Americans and the British moved fairly quickly toward pragmatism, retaining many former party members in technical and professional positions, while pursuing criminal prosecution only against those who had committed specific atrocities or who had been in positions of real political and ideological leadership. This pragmatism would later become a significant source of controversy and recrimination, with critics arguing that it allowed Nazi criminals to escape justice and that it sent the wrong message about accountability. But the alternative, complete administrative paralysis in a country of 80 million people that had just fought a total war, was simply not viable. The four-power Allied Control Council met for the first time on August 30th, 1945, at the Allied Control Authority building in Berlin, a massive neoclassical structure that the Nazis had built to house the German Air Ministry and that had somehow survived the war largely intact. The Council's early meetings dealt with a bewildering range of practical questions: how to manage the enormous flow of displaced persons moving across Germany, how to organize food distribution in a country whose agricultural output had collapsed, how to restart some basic level of economic activity without inadvertently rebuilding the war machine, how to manage the currency in a country where the Reichsmark had become nearly worthless. On some of these practical questions, the four powers found it possible to cooperate. On others, the differences in their approaches made agreement increasingly difficult. The American commanders in Germany, First General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had led the Allied forces in Europe and was briefly the American military governor of Germany, and then General Lucius Clay, who took over from Eisenhower in November 1945 and remained the dominant American figure in German occupation policy for years. Afterward, were committed to making the four-power framework work, but they also had very clear ideas about how Germany should be run, and were not willing to defer to Soviet preferences on fundamental matters. General Lucius Clay deserves particular attention because he was arguably the single most important American decision-maker on the ground in Germany during the critical years of 1945 to 1949. Born in 1897 in Marietta, Georgia, into a family with deep roots in Southern politics, his father had been a United States Senator. Clay had attended West Point and built a career as a military engineer rather than a combat commander. He had spent much of the war managing the enormous logistical challenge of supplying Allied forces in Europe, a role that gave him exceptional administrative skills and an unsentimental, practical approach to problem solving. As Deputy Military Governor and then Military Governor of the American Zone, Clay had extraordinary power over the lives of millions of Germans. He supervised the denazification process, managed the currency, negotiated with his Allied counterparts, and made hundreds of decisions that shaped the social and political landscape of post-war Western Germany. Clay was not a simple cold warrior. He was genuinely committed to four-power cooperation in Germany and spent considerable political capital in Washington, defending arrangements with the Soviets that his political superiors were growing uncomfortable with. But he was also a realist, and as it became clear in 1946 and 1947 that Soviet intentions in Germany were fundamentally incompatible with Western goals, he shifted his position and became one of the architects of Western Germany's separate development. Clay's relationship with his Soviet counterpart, Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, was one of the most important bilateral relationships in post-war Europe, and one of the least discussed. Sokolovsky was a career military officer who had served throughout the Second World War, rising to become Chief of Staff of Soviet forces in Germany after the victory. He was a polished, intelligent man who spoke carefully and committed himself to nothing without explicit authorization from Moscow. His dealings with Clay were correct, sometimes even cordial, but became increasingly frosty as the two powers' incompatible visions for Germany became clearer. The moment that definitively ended any pretense of genuine four-power cooperation in Germany came on March 20th, 1948, when Sokolovsky walked out of an Allied Control Council meeting and the Soviet Union ceased to participate in the body. From that point on, the four-power administration of Germany as a whole was dead. The practical reality of two Germanys, already evident on the ground in the different political and economic systems developing in the Soviet and Western zones, had become formalized at the level of governance. To understand why the four-power framework collapsed so completely and so quickly, you need to understand the broader diplomatic context of 1945 to 1948, the period in which the wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union disintegrated into the Cold War. The first major crises came in Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union was systematically installing communist-dominated governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, in clear violation, or at least in creative reinterpretation, of the agreements made at Yalta about free elections and democratic governance. The Western powers protested, but found themselves with little leverage. They had no military forces in these countries, no economic relationships to threaten, and no appetite for another war after the devastation of the one just ended. Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech, delivered at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, on March 5, 1946, put into public language what Western diplomats had been saying privately for months. Churchill declared that, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent and urged the English-speaking peoples to unite against what he saw as Soviet expansionism. The speech was controversial at the time. Truman, who had been present, initially distanced himself from it, though he had actually approved it in advance, but it accurately captured the emerging reality of European politics. The specific developments in Germany mirrored and amplified these broader trends. In the Soviet zone, the forced merger in April 1946 of the Communist Party of Germany with the Social Democratic Party to create the Socialist Unity Party, known by its German initials as the SED, was a particular turning point. The merger had been pushed through over the objections of most Social Democratic members in the Soviet zone, using a combination of pressure, intimidation, and outright coercion. Social Democrats who resisted were threatened, arrested, or driven out of the party. The result was a nominally unified workers' party that was in reality a Stalinist instrument controlled by the communist faction. In the western sectors of Berlin, Social Democrats voted overwhelmingly against the merger in a referendum, with more than 80% rejecting it, but their votes counted for nothing in the Soviet zone. The forced merger sent an unmistakable signal about the political system the Soviets intended to build in their zone. It would be a system in which the Communist Party held undivided power, regardless of what ordinary Germans wanted. This was not the democratization that the Allies had agreed to at Potsdam. It was its precise opposite. Meanwhile, the economic situation in Germany was becoming catastrophic. The Western occupation zones faced an enormous humanitarian crisis. Millions of displaced persons, refugees from the eastern territories, returning prisoners of war, all needing food, shelter, and employment in a country whose productive capacity had been devastated by the war and further reduced by the removal of industrial equipment as reparations. The British zone in particular was in a desperate situation. Britain itself was exhausted and near bankrupt after the war, and the cost of feeding and administering the densely populated northwestern zone was placing an enormous strain on British finances. It was partly this economic desperation that drove Britain to propose merging its zone with the American zone in a structure known as Bizonia, which came into effect on January 1, 1947. Bizonia created a joint economic administration for the British and American zones, with common policies on trade, industry, and food distribution. It was not yet a political union, but it was a significant step toward the separate economic development of the Western zones, and it was a clear signal that the Western Allies were no longer waiting for the four-power framework to produce results. The French, under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle and then his successors, had taken a somewhat different approach to their occupation zone than the British and Americans. De Gaulle was deeply suspicious of both the Anglo-Americans and the Soviets, and French policy in the occupation zone reflected an old-fashioned national interest rather than any ideology of East-West confrontation. France wanted to exploit the Saar's coal mines for French industry, wanted to maintain strict limits on German economic recovery that might threaten French competitiveness, and wanted to ensure that Germany could never again threaten French security. For this reason, France consistently blocked proposals in the Allied Control Council that would have given Germany unified economic administration, fearing that a unified Germany, even a democratic one, would quickly become too powerful for France to manage. France vetoed the creation of central German administrative departments, blocked the development of common German economic policies, and generally obstructed the kind of coordinated governance that might have preserved some version of four-power cooperation. The French position would eventually soften as it became clearer that the real threat to European security came from the East rather than from a defeated Germany, and France eventually joined the Anglo-American Bisonia structure in 1948 to create Trizonia. But in the period from 1945 to 1947, French obstructionism was a significant complicating factor in the story of how Germany came to be divided. The Stuttgart speech delivered by American Secretary of State James Burns on September 6, 1946, was a watershed moment in American policy toward Germany and deserves careful attention. Speaking at the State Theatre in Stuttgart before an audience that included German civil leaders and Allied representatives, Burns articulated a new American approach that represented a significant departure from the punitive attitudes that had initially characterized American occupation policy. He announced that the United States intended to stay in Germany as long as there was an occupation army of any of the other powers, pushing back directly against Soviet suggestions that American troops might withdraw from Europe. He promised that the United States would support German economic recovery and self-governance, declaring that the American people want to help the German people to win their way back to an honorable place among the free and peace-loving nations of the world. He raised the possibility of revising the Oder Neisse line, which gave the speech particular resonance with the millions of Germans expelled from the Eastern territories. The Stuttgart speech was not just a statement of American policy. It was a message to the German people that the United States saw them not as permanent enemies to be kept in subjugation, but as potential partners in the reconstruction of a free Europe. And it was a message to the Soviet Union that the United States was prepared to dig in for a long-term competition for the political loyalty of the German people. The response in Moscow to the Stuttgart speech was predictably hostile. Soviet newspapers denounced it as a provocation and evidence of American imperialist ambitions in Europe. Soviet propaganda began to portray the Western occupation zones as a hotbed of unreformed Nazism, controlled by American capitalists who were cynically rehabilitating fascists to use as a weapon against the Soviet Union. There was, in all fairness, enough truth in this characterization. The Western denazification efforts had indeed been compromised by pragmatism and the requirements of the Cold War to give Soviet propaganda something to work with. But the Soviet characterization of American policy was fundamentally dishonest, just as the American characterization of Soviet policy as pure totalitarianism missed some of the genuine security concerns that drove Soviet behavior. The propaganda war over Germany, over who was responsible for its division and who bore the moral burden of its fate, would continue for decades, with each side having enough real ammunition to maintain the argument indefinitely. It was against this background of deteriorating East-West relations and increasingly divergent development paths in the different occupation zones that the decisive crisis of post-war German history arrived, the Berlin blockade. The immediate trigger was currency reform. Throughout the occupation period, the Allied powers had been unable to agree on a common German currency policy, and the result was a chaotic monetary situation in which the old Reichsmark was essentially worthless. Cigarettes served as a medium of exchange, and the black market was the primary mechanism for distributing goods. In the Western zones, American economic advisors, led by the German-American economist Ludwig Erhard, were developing plans for a comprehensive currency reform that would introduce a new, stable currency, the Deutsche Mark, and begin the process of establishing a functioning market economy. The Soviets objected to any currency reform that did not cover all four zones under joint control, partly because they were printing vast quantities of Reichsmarks in their own zone to cover occupation costs and did not want to lose that financial tool. When it became clear that the Western Allies were going to proceed with currency reform in their zones regardless, the stage was set for confrontation. On June 18, 1948, the Western Allies announced the introduction of the new Deutsche Mark in their occupation zones. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union responded by blocking all surface access to West Berlin from the Western zones. Rail lines were closed, road bridges were declared under repair, and barge traffic on the canals was halted. Berlin, which lay 110 miles inside the Soviet zone, was suddenly cut off from the Western world. 2 million people in the Western. Sectors of Berlin were dependent on supplies that could no longer be transported by land. The Soviets, apparently, expected that the Western Allies would either negotiate from weakness, making concessions on currency reform and the broader German question, or withdraw from Berlin entirely, giving the Soviet Union complete control of the city. They profoundly miscalculated both the Western response and the organizational capacity of the United States Air Force. General Lucius Clay's response to the blockade was characteristically direct. His first instinct was to send an armed convoy down the Autobahn to Berlin, an approach that would have risked armed confrontation with Soviet forces. He was overruled by Washington, which was unwilling to risk a shooting war. But the alternative that was authorized, supplying Berlin entirely by air, was something that most military experts initially considered impossible. Could you supply a city of 2 million people with everything they needed day in and day out entirely by aircraft? Clay was convinced you could, and he was right. The Berlin airlift, which officially began on June 26, 1948 and continued for over a year, became one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in history. At its peak, American and British transport aircraft were landing in West Berlin every 90 seconds around the clock, bringing in everything from coal and flour to newsprint and machinery. The pilots flew in all weathers, in fog and ice and rain, navigating by instrument through the narrow air corridors that had been designated for Western aircraft. 28 aircraft were lost in accidents during the airlift, and 39 airmen and 6 Germans died in the operation. The Soviet Union eventually backed down, lifting the blockade on May 12, 1949, having failed to dislodge the Western Allies from Berlin and having dramatically strengthened Western resolve and Western popular support for the defence of West Germany. The Berlin airlift was not just a logistical triumph. It was a psychological and political watershed. For the German people in the Western zones, it demonstrated that the United States and its allies were genuinely committed to their protection and their freedom, and it transformed the relationship between West Germans and the Western Allies in ways that accelerated the political development of West Germany. For the Soviet Union, it was an embarrassing defeat that demonstrated the limits of coercive diplomacy in the face of determined Western resistance. And for the broader international community, it established a precedent. The Western Allies would not be dislodged from Berlin without a fight, and the Soviet Union was not willing to fight a war over it. This implicit understanding would govern the Berlin situation for the next 4 decades, though it would be tested repeatedly and dramatically. The men who flew the Berlin airlift became heroes on both sides of the Atlantic, but one deserves particular mention because of the human dimension he brought to what might otherwise have been a purely logistical operation. Lieutenant Gail Halvorson, an American transport pilot from Utah, began dropping candy to the children of West Berlin from his aircraft during the airlift. He would wiggle the wings of his plane as he approached the city so that the children watching from the ground would know it was him, earning himself the nickname the Candy Bomber. The gesture was unofficial and initially unauthorized, but when his superiors discovered it, they encouraged rather than punished it, and eventually the United States Air Force organized an official version of the candy drops called Operation Little Victuals. Thousands of parcels of candy were dropped on West Berlin, and children sent Halvorson letters of thanks from around the world. This small human story within the larger geopolitical drama captures something important about the Berlin airlift. It was not just a political and military operation, but a genuinely popular one, an expression of something real about American values, and the relationship being built between the Western powers and the German people. In a period when the grand diplomatic decisions about Germany's fate were being made by small groups of powerful men in conference rooms, the Berlin airlift reminded everyone that millions of ordinary human beings were living through the consequences of those decisions. The currency reform that had triggered the blockade, the introduction of the Deutsche Mark on June 20, 1948, was itself a decisive moment in Germany's division. Ludwig Erhard, the economist who had designed the reform and who would later become one of the architects of the West German economic miracle, was a physically imposing man with an ever-present cigar and an unshakable conviction in the virtues of market economics. Born in 1897 in Fürth, Bavaria, Erhard had spent the Nazi period in relative obscurity, working at an economic research institute and avoiding the kind of political commitment that might have compromised him after the war. His moment came when the American occupation authorities were looking for German economic expertise, and Erhard, with his extensive background in economic research and his uncontaminated political record, was exactly what they needed. He was appointed as the director of the economic administration of the Bi-Zone, the joint British-American economic body, in February 1948, just months before the currency reform was implemented. The reform he designed was radical. Overnight, the old worthless Reichsmarks were converted to Deutsche Marks at a ratio of 10-to-1 for most holdings, wiping out the accumulated savings of millions of Germans, but also clearing away the monetary debris of the Nazi period and creating a sound basis for economic recovery. Coupled with the simultaneous removal of most price controls, the currency reform unleashed an enormous burst of economic activity. Shops that had been empty of goods suddenly filled overnight as merchants who had been hoarding commodities rather than accepting worthless currency brought their stocks to market. The West German economy began to grow with a speed that astonished the world and became known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The Soviet response to the Western currency reform in their own zone was to introduce a separate East German currency, also called the Deutsche Mark initially, but distinguished from the Western version. Eventually, the East German currency would become known as the Eastmark or the Ostmark, a currency that existed in a strange parallel economic universe where official exchange rates bore no relationship to market realities and where the contrast between the goods available in East and West Germany became an increasingly powerful indictment of the communist economic system. The currency divergence of June 1948 was not just a monetary event, it was the moment when the economic division of Germany became irreversible. You cannot share a country with two different currencies without one zone inevitably pulling away from the other, and the trajectory of the two currency zones was diverging dramatically and visibly from the moment of their introduction. The political division of Germany was formalized in 1949 through two separate processes that produced two entirely different constitutional frameworks. In the Western zones, the process began with the London Programme of June 1948. A series of agreements between the three Western Allies and the Benelux countries that authorized the convening of a constituent assembly to draft a constitution for a West German state. The German political leaders in the Western zones, working in a parliamentary council that met in Bonn, produced over the following months the document that became known as the Basic Law, or Grundgesetz in German. The Basic Law was deliberately presented as a provisional document rather than a full constitution, partly because its authors hoped it would eventually be superseded by a constitution for a reunified Germany, and partly because calling it a constitution would have implied a permanence and finality to Germany's division that the Western Allies and most German politicians were not yet ready to accept. The word German in the title of the new state, the Federal Republic of Germany, was a deliberate assertion of the claim to speak for all Germans, not just those in the three Western zones. The man who presided over the Parliamentary Council and who would become the dominant political figure in early West Germany was Konrad Adenauer, and his story is one of the most remarkable in 20th century European history. Adenauer was born in 1876 in Cologne, the son of a court clerk, and had studied law and economics before entering politics in the Catholic Centre Party. He had been mayor of Cologne from 1917 to 1933, a period during which he had developed a reputation as an efficient and relatively progressive administrator. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they removed him from office, and he spent the following 12 years in enforced retirement and occasional persecution, including a brief arrest in 1934 and a more serious detention in 1944 following the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler, during which Adenauer was suspected of involvement despite having played no actual part in the conspiracy. He was 70 years old when the war ended, and by any reasonable calculation, his political career was over. But the occupation period created extraordinary opportunities for elderly statesmen of untarnished democratic credentials, and Adenauer seized his chance with a tenacity and strategic intelligence that belied his age. As the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, which he became in September 1949, Adenauer would serve until 1963, 14 years in office at an age when most men are long, retired. His strategic vision was clear and he pursued it with remarkable consistency. West Germany must anchor itself irrevocably to the Western alliance, must integrate itself into European institutions, must rebuild trust with France in particular, and must pursue reunification only through Western unity, rather than through separate negotiations with the Soviet Union. He was deeply Catholic, deeply conservative, deeply suspicious of Prussian militarism, and deeply committed to the proposition that the only safe Germany was a Germany embedded in a democratic, Christian, Western European framework. His critics accused him of sacrificing German unity for Western integration, of choosing Adenauer's Germany over Germany itself. His defenders argued that his choices were the only ones available to a responsible statesman in his position, and that they laid the foundations for the eventual peaceful reunification of Germany in 1990. The debate continues, but there is no question that Adenauer's personality, his strategic vision, and his political skill were decisive factors in shaping the character of the West German state. The Basic Law that Adenauer helped craft and that the Parliamentary Council adopted in May 1949 was a remarkable document, one that had absorbed the lessons of the Weimar Republic's failure and was specifically designed to prevent the kind of democratic collapse that had brought Hitler to power. It established a parliamentary democracy with a chancellor as the effective head of government and a president as a largely ceremonial head of state. It included a principle called the Eternity Clause embedded in Article 79, which declared that certain fundamental provisions of the Basic Law, including human dignity, the democratic and federal character of the state, and the protection of fundamental rights, could never be amended even by a constitutional majority. This was a direct response to the way the Nazi movement had exploited the legal mechanisms of the Weimar Constitution to dismantle democracy from within. The Basic Law also included what became known as the constructive vote of no confidence, a mechanism that meant the Bundestag could only remove a chancellor by simultaneously electing a successor, preventing the kind of negative coalitions that had paralyzed Weimar governance. These institutional innovations, drawing on the bitter experience of Germany's democratic failure, produced a constitutional framework of considerable resilience that served West Germany well and was eventually extended to cover the whole of unified Germany in 1990. The Western Allies had been deeply involved in the drafting of the Basic Law. The three military governors, Clay for the Americans, General Sir Brian Robertson for the British, and General Pierre Koenig for the French, had issued a document known as the Frankfurt Documents in July 1948, which set out the parameters within which the German Constituent Assembly was to work. The Western Allies insisted on certain structural features. The new state must be federal to prevent the re-emergence of the kind of highly centralized government that the Nazi state had operated. It must include an independent judiciary and protection of fundamental rights. And it must be sufficiently democratic to qualify for eventual integration into the Western community of nations. Within these parameters, the German constitutional drafters had considerable freedom, and they used it well. The Basic Law was approved by the Parliamentary Council on May 8, 1949, exactly 4 years after Germany's unconditional surrender, and ratified by the parliaments of all the West German states except Bavaria, which voted against it for reasons of Bavarian particularism, without thereby preventing its application. On May 23, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was formally proclaimed. General Brian Robertson, the British military governor, is a figure who deserves more attention than he typically receives in histories of this period. The son of Field Marshal Sir William Robertson, the first man to rise from private to Field Marshal in the British Army, Brian Robertson had inherited his father's meticulous professionalism and his father's extraordinary social journey, though in the reverse direction, where the elder Robertson had risen from the bottom of the military hierarchy to its summit, Brian Robertson moved through the British establishment with the ease of someone born near the top. He had served in the First World War, had pursued a business career in the interwar period, managing industrial operations in South Africa, and had returned to military service in the Second World War to become one of Montgomery's most trusted logistics officers. As the British military governor of Germany from 1947 to 1949, Robertson worked closely with Lucius Clay in developing the Bizonia structure and in managing the Berlin airlift. He was a quieter and less publicly prominent figure than Clay, but those who worked with him rated him highly for his intelligence, his steadiness under pressure, and his ability to find pragmatic solutions to complex problems. He returned to Britain in 1949 and eventually became chairman of British Transport, but his years in Germany during the critical period of 1945 to 1949 made him one of the architects of the Western German settlement. The French military governor, General Pierre Koenig, represented a country that had its own complicated relationship with the German occupation. France had been occupied by Germany during the war, had experienced collaboration and resistance, and all the moral complexity that those experiences entailed, and had emerged from the war with a burning desire to prevent Germany from ever again threatening French security. De Gaulle's government and the Fourth Republic governments that succeeded it pursued French interests in Germany with a persistence and sometimes a narrowness of focus that occasionally infuriated the Americans and British. The French insisted on maintaining their separate occupation zone rather than joining Bizonia in 1947, only agreeing to join what became Trizonia in early 1948. They were determined to keep the Saar region with its rich coal deposits under French economic control as long as possible. They used their veto on the Allied Control Council to block any measures they regarded as threatening French interests, yet France also brought something valuable to the Western project in Germany: a long historical memory of European wars, a genuine commitment to European reconciliation once it was clear that West Germany was committed to the Western Alliance, and an instinct for the kind of political symbolism that translated abstract commitments into durable realities. The Franco-German reconciliation that Adenauer and de Gaulle would formalize in the Élysée Treaty of 1963 had its roots in the difficult, often contentious relationship between the French occupation authorities and German civil society in the late 1940s. While West Germany was building its constitutional framework in the spring of 1949, the Soviet zone was moving down a very different path. The Socialist Unity Party under Walter Ulbricht had consolidated its grip on power throughout 1947 and 1948, suppressing opposition parties, controlling the media, collectivizing agriculture, and nationalizing industry. The political system being built in the Soviet zone bore no resemblance to the democratic pluralism of the West German system. It was a single-party state modelled on the Soviet system, with the SED occupying the leading role in all aspects of social, economic and political life. Opposition politicians were arrested, intimidated or driven out of the zone. Churches were pressured to conform to the state's ideological demands. Schools were redesigned to promote Marxist-Leninist ideology. The institutions of civil society, trade unions, professional associations, youth organizations were captured by the party and converted into instruments of political control. This was not democratization as Potsdam had defined it. It was the construction of a replica of the Soviet state on German soil. The German Democratic Republic, known in English by its German initials as the GDR, was formally proclaimed on October 7, 1949, about 5 months after the Federal Republic was established in the West. Its first president was Wilhelm Pieck, an elderly communist veteran who served as a largely ceremonial figurehead. The real power resided with Walter Ulbricht, who held the position of First Secretary of the SED and used it to manage the state with the kind of meticulous control that was the hallmark of Stalinist governance. The GDR immediately declared itself the legitimate German state and denounced the Federal Republic as a puppet creation of American imperialism. The Federal Republic declared itself the legitimate representative of all Germans and refused to recognize the GDR's existence, a policy known as the Hallstein Doctrine, after Walter Hallstein, the West German State Secretary who articulated it, under which West Germany would break diplomatic relations with any country that recognized the GDR. This policy of mutual non-recognition would persist for over 2 decades, with each German state denying the other's legitimacy, while the two Germanys stared at each other across a heavily fortified border that cut through families, communities, and the very heart of Europe. The border between the two Germanys deserves attention as a physical and political reality, because it was not always the impenetrable barrier it eventually became. In the years immediately after 1949, movement between East and West Germany was restricted, but not impossible, and many East Germans took advantage of this relative permeability to move westward. The combination of a superior standard of living in the West and a political system in the East that offered little freedom and considerable hardship made the migration enormously appealing to millions of people, particularly younger, better educated East Germans. Doctors, engineers, teachers, skilled workers, precisely the people whose skills the East German economy most desperately needed, were leaving in their hundreds of thousands, bleeding the GDR of its most productive citizens. Between 1949 and 1961, approximately 3 million East Germans emigrated to the West, nearly 20% of the GDR's entire population. The principal route for this emigration was through Berlin, where someone living in the Soviet sector could simply take the S-Bahn, the metropolitan railway that continued to operate across sector boundaries, to a Western sector and present themselves to West German authorities as a refugee. The flow was embarrassing to the East German government and to the Soviet Union, a daily visible advertisement of the failure of the communist system to hold the loyalty of its own citizens. The question of whether and how to stop this emigration was one that the East German leadership wrestled with throughout the 1950s. Ulbricht repeatedly asked Moscow for permission to seal the Berlin border, and Moscow repeatedly refused, concerned that a dramatic physical barrier would be a propaganda disaster and would provoke a Western military response. But by 1961, the situation had become unsustainable. The East German economy was hemorrhaging its most skilled workers at a rate that threatened its basic functioning. In the first 12 days of August 1961 alone, some 47,000 people fled west through Berlin. Khrushchev, who had succeeded Stalin as Soviet leader after the latter's death in March 1953, finally gave Ulbricht the authorization he had been seeking. In the early morning hours of Sunday, August 13, 1961, East German troops and police began stringing barbed wire across the border between East and West Berlin, closing the sector crossings and beginning the construction of what would eventually become the Berlin Wall. The operation was carried out with impressive operational security. Western intelligence had received no warning, and by the time Western leaders were aware of what was happening, the basic barrier was already in place. The wall, as it developed over the following weeks and years, became a complex system of fortifications that eventually extended 155 kilometers around the three western sectors of Berlin, and a further 1,400 kilometers along the entire inner German border. It included a death strip, a cleared zone between two parallel walls, patrolled by armed guards with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. Between 1961 and 1989, at least 140 people were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall, and the true figure may be higher. Many more were killed or died in attempts to cross. The inner German border more broadly. Nikita Khrushchev had authorized the wall and deserves our attention here because his role in the division of Germany was as significant as Stalin's, if somewhat different in character. Khrushchev was born in 1894 in Kalinovka, a village near the border of Russia and Ukraine, to a mining family, and had worked as a miner and metal worker before becoming a full-time party official. He had risen through the Soviet Communist Party during the Stalin era, participating in the purges and surviving them through a combination of ruthlessness, intelligence, and sheer luck. After Stalin's death, he emerged as the dominant figure in Soviet politics through a combination of political maneuvering that eventually left him as first secretary of the party and, from 1958, premier of the Soviet government as well. Khrushchev was a very different character from Stalin. Louder, more spontaneous, capable of genuine charm as well as brutal threat, and responsible for the famous 1956 speech in which he denounced Stalin's crimes to a secret session of the party congress and launched the process of de-Stalinization. His relationship with Germany was dominated by two objectives. He wanted to formalize the division of the country on terms favorable to the Soviet Union, which meant getting Western recognition of the GDR and of the Oder-Neisse border with Poland, and he wanted to end the Western military presence in West Berlin, which he famously described as a bone stuck in my throat. Khrushchev's approach to the Berlin problem was to use it as leverage, issuing ultimatums that the Western powers must negotiate a settlement within a specified time frame, or face Soviet recognition of full East German sovereignty over the access routes to Berlin. He issued his first Berlin ultimatum in November 1958, giving the Western Allies 6 months to agree to make West Berlin a demilitarized free city. The Western Allies refused, the deadline passed without action, and Khrushchev did not follow through on his implied threats. He issued further ultimatums and then backed away from them, creating a pattern of escalation and de-escalation that stretched Western nerves throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. The construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961 was in some ways an admission that his ultimatum strategy had failed. Unable to dislodge the Western Allies from Berlin through diplomatic pressure, the Soviet Union and East Germany settled for physically sealing the border to stop the population hemorrhage, accepting the continuation of the Western presence in exchange for ending the embarrassment of mass emigration. The American response to the wall's construction was notably restrained. President John F. Kennedy, who had been in office for less than 7 months when the wall went up, was privately relieved that Khrushchev had opted to build a wall rather than to challenge Western access rights to Berlin directly, telling his advisers that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. Kennedy recognized that the Western powers had no legal basis for preventing East Germany from sealing its own border. The four-power agreements that governed Berlin's status said nothing about the right of citizens of one sector to cross into another, and that any military response would risk a confrontation that could escalate uncontrollably. What the Western Allies could and did do was insist on their own rights: the right to travel between the Western sectors and their zones, the right to be in Berlin at all, the right to fly through the air corridors. These rights were maintained, tested occasionally by Soviet provocations, and ultimately preserved. Kennedy's visit to West Berlin on June 26, 1963, produced one of the most famous speeches in Cold War history. Standing before a crowd of hundreds of thousands of jubilant West Berliners in front of the Schöneberg City Hall, Kennedy delivered a speech that was partly scripted and partly improvised, and that culminated in the declaration that has echoed through history. Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner. The speech was a statement of American commitment to the defense of West Berlin and, by extension, to the broader cause of Western freedom in the face of Soviet pressure. The crowd's response was overwhelming, not just applause, but a roar of emotion that struck everyone present. Kennedy reportedly told his aide Ted Sorensen afterward that the Germans were the hardest to satisfy, and that if you said the right thing to them, you could move them to ecstasy. Whether the story is entirely accurate or slightly embellished, it captures something real about the emotional power of that moment and about what the Berlin question meant to ordinary Germans living in the shadow of the wall. The division of Germany was not simply a political and military phenomenon. It was a human tragedy on an enormous scale, separating families, communities, and people who shared a common language, culture, and history. The stories of divided families are too numerous and too painful to catalogue completely, but some deserve mention as illustrations of the human cost. There were families whose homes straddled what became the inner German border, who woke one morning to find a fence running through their garden or their street. There were couples whose planned weddings were made impossible by the border's closing. There were parents who watched their children grow up in a different country and political system, connected only by letters that were read by state censors. There were people who had fled East Germany before 1961 who would not see their families again for decades, or in some cases, ever. The wall did not just divide a city, it divided lives. The question of what ordinary Germans in the Eastern Zone thought about all of this is one that historians have grappled with seriously. For a long time, the dominant Western narrative depicted all East Germans as victims of Soviet and communist oppression, longing for freedom and liberation. This narrative contains important truth, but is also inadequate as a complete account. Many East Germans did support the communist system, either from genuine conviction or from the kind of accommodation with circumstances that is simply human nature. The GDR developed its own civic culture, its own achievements in sport and science and literature, its own social rituals and community bonds. The system provided full employment, subsidized housing, guaranteed education, and a certain kind of stability that some people genuinely valued. This does not mean they would have chosen it over the freedoms available in the West if given a genuine choice. The wall's existence was itself the most eloquent possible commentary on that question. But it does mean that the human reality of East Germany was more complex than simple oppression and resistance. George Catlett Marshall, one of the towering figures of American 20th century history, deserves particular attention in the story of Germany's division, because his Marshall Plan, formerly known as the European Recovery Programme, was the economic framework within which West Germany's recovery and integration into the Western Alliance took place. Marshall was born in 1880 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute, and had distinguished himself in the First World War as a planning officer and staff officer of extraordinary ability. General Pershing had rated him the most talented officer in the American Army, and he had spent the interwar period in a variety of difficult and unglamorous assignments that gave him an unparalleled breadth of military experience. As Army Chief of Staff during the Second World War, Marshall had been the principal architect of American military strategy and the man who more than anyone else organized the transformation of a small peacetime army into the multi-million-person force that fought on 3 continents. After the war, Truman sent him to China on a diplomatic mission to mediate the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, a mission that failed but that demonstrated Marshall's willingness to serve in any capacity the country required. He became Secretary of State in January 1947 and served until 1949, during which period he launched the initiative that would bear his name. The Marshall Plan, announced by Marshall in a speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947, offered American economic assistance to all European countries willing to participate in a cooperative reconstruction program. The program was deliberately presented as available to Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union, as well as to Western Europe, though it came with conditions about economic transparency and cooperation that Stalin found unacceptable. Soviet pressure prevented the Eastern European countries from participating, and the Marshall Plan became in practice a program for Western European recovery. For West Germany, the Marshall Plan was of enormous importance, both for the financial resources it provided. About $1.4 billion went to West Germany between 1948 and 1952, and for the psychological and political message it sent. The United States was committed to Germany's economic recovery and integration into a free European economy. Combined with the currency reform and Erhard's economic policies, the Marshall Plan helped ignite the West German economic miracle that transformed the country from a rubble-strewn wasteland in 1945 to the most productive economy in Europe by the late 1950s. The contrast with East Germany's economic trajectory could not have been more striking. While West Germany's GDP was growing at rates of 8 to 10% per year in the early 1950s, the East German economy was constrained by central planning, the continuing extraction of reparations by the Soviet Union, and the absence of the market mechanisms that were generating such dynamism in the West. The Soviet Union extracted reparations from East Germany until 1953, when a workers' uprising in the GDR, sparked in part by economic grievances, prompted Khrushchev's government to finally end the reparations program and provide some economic assistance to stabilize the East German regime. The June 17, 1953 uprising, in which hundreds of thousands of workers across East Germany went on strike and took to the streets to protest working conditions and political repression, was suppressed by Soviet tanks. It was a defining moment in the history of the GDR, demonstrating both the depth of popular discontent and the limits of what protest could achieve against an occupying military power. In West Germany, June 17th was declared a national holiday, the Day of German Unity, observed annually until reunification in 1990. The division of Germany was also a division of German history and memory. Both states had to come to terms with the Nazi past, but they did so in very different ways. In the Federal Republic, there was initially considerable reluctance to confront Nazism directly in public discourse. Many former Nazis had been quietly reintegrated into public life under the pragmatic denazification policies of the early occupation period, and there were powerful pressures for silence and forgetting, rather than examination and accountability. The Adenauer government included several figures with at least questionable wartime records, and Adenauer himself, though personally uninvolved in Nazi crimes, presided over a political culture that preferred not to look too closely at what had happened during the Hitler years. The change came gradually through a series of watershed moments. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, which forced West Germans to confront the systematic nature of the Holocaust. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, which prosecuted lower-level Holocaust perpetrators and generated enormous public attention, and the cultural and political upheaval of 1968, in which a younger generation confronted their parents and demanded accountability for the crimes of the Nazi period. By the 1970s and 1980s, West Germany had developed a culture of memory and accountability that was genuinely reckoning with its past in ways that were, if imperfect, at least serious. In the GDR, the official approach to the Nazi past was different in its ideological framing, but arguably no more honest in its practical application. The East German state officially portrayed itself as the anti-fascist German state, the state that had been built by those who had fought and resisted Nazism rather than collaborated with it. The communist leaders who ran the GDR could legitimately claim that most of them had indeed been persecuted by the Nazis. The Communist Party of Germany had been one of the first organizations banned by Hitler, and many of its leaders had spent years in concentration camps or exile. But this anti-fascist legitimating narrative was used to exempt the GDR from any need to examine its own complicity in the Nazi past or to provide restitution to the victims of Nazism. East Germany paid no reparations to Israel or to Holocaust survivors, unlike West Germany, which had negotiated the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952 with Israel that provided substantial financial restitution. And the anti-fascist narrative served a political function. It allowed the GDR to denounce West Germany as a fascist state run by rehabilitated Nazis, while deflecting any scrutiny of its own record. The nuclear question was also bound up inextricably with the division of Germany throughout this period. West Germany's integration into NATO, formalized by the Paris Agreements of 1954, and West Germany's accession to the alliance in 1955, gave the Federal Republic access to the Western military umbrella, including the American nuclear deterrent. But it also raised questions that were enormously sensitive both domestically and internationally. Would West Germany eventually seek its own nuclear weapons? Could the German military, the Bundeswehr established in 1955, be trusted not to become once again an instrument of aggression? The answer that Adenauer and his successors gave was to embed the Bundeswehr deeply in NATO's integrated military command structure, to accept limitations on German military sovereignty as the price of Western integration, and to forswear the development of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons under the terms of the Western European Union. These commitments were made credible by the institutional framework of NATO and the European Economic Community, and they gradually convinced Germany's neighbours that the country had genuinely changed. The process was long, sometimes painful, and never entirely free of suspicion, but it eventually produced the result that Adenauer had sought, a West Germany that was trusted and respected as a partner rather than feared as a potential aggressor. The decade of the 1960s brought new complications to the German question. Kennedy's administration developed the concept of détente, the relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union through negotiation and engagement, as an alternative to the confrontational approach that had characterized the early Cold War. For Germany, détente had a specific application. Could the two German states find ways to interact and cooperate that would reduce the human costs of division, even if they could not overcome it politically? This question produced the concept known in German as Wandel durch Annäherung, change through rapprochement, articulated by the journalist and politician Egon Bahr, who would become one of the architects of West German Ostpolitik, the policy of engagement with the East. Bahr argued that the West's confrontational approach to the GDR was counterproductive, that it simply drove the two Germanys further apart without improving the lives of East Germans or advancing the cause of eventual reunification. A more pragmatic approach, one that accepted the reality of the GDR's existence without formally recognizing its legitimacy, might achieve more in terms of actual improvements in human conditions and actual movement toward eventual unity. This approach would be taken up with enormous consequence by Willy Brandt in the late 1960s and early 1970s, transforming the political landscape of the German question. Willy Brandt is one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire story of Germany's division and its eventual path toward reunification, and his life story is as dramatic as any novel. Born Herbert Ernst Karl Frahm in Lübeck in 1913, the illegitimate son of a shop assistant mother who raised him alone, Brandt had joined the Social Democratic youth movement as a teenager and had been so deeply involved in anti-Nazi politics that he fled Germany when Hitler came to power in 1933. He spent the Nazi years in exile in Scandinavia, living in Norway and Sweden, working as a journalist and a political activist under the name Willy Brandt, which he adopted to protect himself and his contacts. He returned to Germany after the war, re-entered politics, became the charismatic mayor of West Berlin from 1957 to 1966, and then served as foreign minister in a grand coalition government before becoming chancellor in 1969. His chancellorship from 1969 to 1974 was marked above all by his Ostpolitik, the systematic engagement with East Germany and the Soviet Union that produced a series of landmark agreements. The Treaty of Moscow in 1970, normalizing relations with the Soviet Union. The Treaty of Warsaw in 1970, accepting the Oder-Neisse line and recognizing Polish territorial integrity. The Basic Treaty with East Germany in 1972, establishing diplomatic relations between the two German states, while West Germany maintained its position that the GDR was not a fully foreign country in the legal sense, and the Quadripartite Agreement on Berlin in 1971, which regularized West Berlin's status and improved access conditions between the two halves of the city. The moment that defined Brandt's chancellorship and that gave him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1971 came in Warsaw on December 7, 1970. Standing before the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the heroic 1943 revolt of the Jewish inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto against their Nazi exterminators. Brandt spontaneously fell to his knees in an act of silent penance for the crimes Germany had committed against the Polish people and against the Jewish people. He remained kneeling for about a minute, his head bowed, before rising. He had not planned the gesture, he had not discussed it with his advisors. It simply came from whatever was deepest in him. The image was published around the world and became one of the most powerful visual expressions of German atonement in the entire post-war period. In Germany, reaction was divided. Polls showed that a majority of West Germans thought the gesture was excessive, that Brandt himself had done nothing to require such atonement. But the world's reaction was overwhelmingly positive, and the gesture contributed to the improvement in Germany's international standing that Ostpolitik was designed to achieve. Brandt resigned in 1974 when it was discovered that one of his closest aides, Günther Guillaume, had been an East German spy. The revelation was a bitter personal blow, but it did not reverse the Ostpolitik achievements that had defined his government. The legal framework that governed the German division had evolved considerably by the early 1970s from the relatively simple four-power structure of 1945. The two German states were both members of the United Nations by 1973. They had established diplomatic relations with most of the world's countries, though the question of formal mutual recognition remained legally complex. The Soviet Union and the Western Allies had all signed the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, which included provisions for the inviolability of post-war European borders, a clause that the Soviet Union and East Germany valued as a recognition of the GDR's legitimacy and the permanence of the Oder-Neisse border, but also included provisions for human rights and freedom of movement that would gradually become tools for dissidents in the Eastern Bloc to demand the fulfillment of commitments their governments had publicly made. The Helsinki Accords, as they became known, were one of those agreements whose full consequences took years to become apparent, but whose eventual impact on the communist systems of Eastern Europe was enormous. In East Germany throughout the 1970s, the regime under Erich Honecker, who had replaced Ulbricht in 1971, was managing a delicate balance between economic necessity and political control. Honecker was born in 1912 in the Saar region, had joined the Communist Party as a teenager, had been imprisoned by the Nazis from 1935 to 1945, and had emerged from prison as one of the most committed and inflexible Stalinists in the East German leadership. He had been the operational commander of the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, which had given him a unique credential in the eyes of the Soviet leadership. As General Secretary of the SED from 1971, he pursued a policy of what he called Abgrenzung, demarcation, seeking to establish the GDR as a distinct and legitimate nation, separate from West Germany, rather than simply the Soviet zone of a divided country. He promoted an East German national identity, invested in East German achievements in sport, particularly in the Olympic Games, where the GDR's performance in doping-enhanced events provided a steady stream of propaganda victories. He also attempted a form of consumer socialism, improving the availability of consumer goods and introducing a range of social benefits, partly funded by hard currency loans from Western banks that would eventually become an enormous and unserviceable debt burden. The economic model that Honecker attempted to maintain, high social expenditure funded by increasingly unproductive planned industry and foreign debt, was ultimately unsustainable, But its collapse came later than many observers expected, and for reasons that had as much to do with external developments as internal ones. The rise of solidarity in Poland in 1980 and 1981, the first independent trade union in the Soviet bloc, sent tremors through every communist government in Eastern Europe. The ability of the Polish workers' movement to organize openly and maintain its existence even under considerable pressure demonstrated that the communist monopoly on social organization was not as impregnable as it had seemed. In the GDR, the regime responded to the Polish example with increased repression, making clear that it would not tolerate any equivalent movement on German soil. The decisive external factor that changed everything was, of course, the arrival of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March 1985. Gorbachev was 54 years old when he took power, the youngest member of the Politburo and dramatically younger than his immediate predecessors, Yuri Andropov, who had died after 15 months in office, and Konstantin Chernenko, who had died after 13 months, had been. He had grown up in the Stavropol region of southern Russia, the son of a tractor driver, and had risen through the Komsomol and party structures with the kind of energetic intelligence that attracted mentors. He had a law degree from Moscow State University and a postgraduate qualification in agricultural economics, and he had spent years managing the Stavropol region before coming to Moscow in 1978. What distinguished him from his predecessors was not just his relative youth, but a genuine understanding that the Soviet system was in deep trouble. The economy was stagnating, technology was falling behind the West at an accelerating rate, the war in Afghanistan was an unwinnable drain on resources and morale, and the ideological legitimacy of the communist system was eroding. He launched his twin programs of glasnost, openness in public discourse, and perestroika, restructuring of the economy, with the intention of saving the Soviet system by reforming it, not of destroying it. Gorbachev's approach to the Eastern European communist states was transformative because he abandoned what had been known since 1968 as the Brezhnev Doctrine, the principle that the Soviet Union had the right and the obligation to use military force to prevent any Eastern European communist state from abandoning the communist system. In 1968, Soviet tanks had rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring. In 1981, the threat of Soviet intervention had been one of the factors that led the Polish military to impose martial law and suppress solidarity. But Gorbachev was not going to send tanks. He told the Eastern European leaders through a series of increasingly clear signals that they were on their own. The Soviet Union would no longer bail them out with military intervention. They had to find their own way to manage the contradictions of their systems. When this became understood, when it was clear that the Brezhnev Doctrine was dead, the pace of change in Eastern Europe accelerated dramatically. In Hungary, the communist government began opening its border with Austria in May 1989, allowing citizens to cross freely. East Germans who could travel to Hungary on holiday suddenly found themselves with an exit route to the west that bypassed the Berlin Wall entirely. Thousands took it, camping in the parks around the West German embassy in Budapest, and eventually flooding through the newly opened border in their Trabants, the small, smoky, two-stroke engined plastic cars that had become emblematic of East German consumer culture, in a human tide that the East German leadership was powerless to stop. By September 1989, more than 50,000 East Germans had emigrated westward through Hungary. In East Germany itself, the Monday demonstrations, weekly protests that had begun in Leipzig's St. Nicholas Church as prayer meetings and had grown into mass political demonstrations, were swelling to hundreds of thousands of participants. On October 9, 1989, about 70,000 people marched in Leipzig demanding political reform. The security forces were present in overwhelming numbers, ready to act, but the order to use force was never given, and the demonstrators marched peacefully. It was a turning point. The regime had blinked. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, was triggered by a bureaucratic blunder of almost comic proportions. The East German leadership, under increasing pressure and desperate to stem the tide of emigration by offering controlled emigration as a safety valve, had approved new regulations allowing East Germans to apply for travel visas to the West. The regulations were supposed to come into effect the following day, after proper announcement and procedure. But at a press conference that evening, Günter Schabowski, a member of the ruling Politburo who had been out of the country when the decision was made and had not been properly briefed on the transition arrangements, read out the new regulations, and when a journalist asked when they would come into effect, he shuffled his papers, consulted his notes, and said, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay." The words were broadcast live. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of East Berliners were streaming toward the wall's crossing points, and the border guards, with no orders to let them through, but equally no orders to shoot, simply opened the barriers. That night, East and West Berliners climbed on the wall. Together, embraced strangers, wept with joy, and began physically demolishing the structure with hammers and picks. The image of the wall coming down was broadcast around the world and became one of the defining images of the 20th century. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl was at a state dinner in Poland when he received the news. He interrupted his visit and flew back to Germany immediately. Kohl, a large, jovial Rhinelander who had led the Christian Democratic Union since 1973 and had been Chancellor since 1982, was not known as a visionary or a particularly eloquent politician. He was known as a survivor, a skilled manager of competing political factions, a pragmatist who had outlasted more glamorous rivals through sheer staying power and political instinct. But he had always maintained, in the face of considerable skepticism from within his own country and from Germany's allies, that German reunification was not just a historical aspiration, but a practical political goal. When the wall fell, he understood immediately and instinctively that the moment had come, and he acted with a decisiveness that surprised even his closest advisers. On November 28, 1989, just 19 days after the wall fell, Kohl presented to the Bundestag a 10-point program for German unity. The program proposed a step-by-step process of increased cooperation between the two German states, moving through confederal arrangements toward eventual full unity. It was carefully designed not to frighten Germany's allies, who had considerable reservations about reunification, or to provoke the Soviet Union. The reaction from Germany's neighbours was indeed mixed. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, was opposed to reunification, fearing that a united Germany would dominate Europe and upset the balance that had maintained the peace since 1945. She reportedly told Gorbachev in a private meeting that neither Britain nor Western Europe wanted the reunification of Germany, though her public statements were more circumspect. François Mitterrand, the French president, was also initially hesitant, though he moved much more quickly than Thatcher to accept the reality of what was happening and to attach his conditions, particularly regarding European integration and the permanent renunciation of German territorial claims beyond the Oder-Neisse line, rather than simply opposing it. Gorbachev's initial reaction was to oppose rapid reunification, though the pace of events in Germany quickly outpaced his ability to manage them from Moscow. The 2+4 process, the diplomatic framework through which German reunification was negotiated, is a remarkable story of rapid and creative diplomacy. The 2 referred to the 2 German states, and the 4 referred to the 4 powers that had occupied Germany since 1945: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. The negotiations that produced the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, signed in Moscow on September 12, 1990, resolved virtually every major external issue relating to German reunification in a matter of months. James Baker, the American Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush, was the architect of the 2+4 framework and drove the process with considerable skill, balancing German aspirations with Allied concerns and Soviet anxieties. Baker was born in 1930 in Houston, Texas, into a prominent legal family, had served in the Marine Corps, and had built a career in Texas law and Republican politics before becoming one of the most accomplished American diplomats of the late 20th century. He had served as Ronald Reagan's Chief of Staff and Treasury Secretary before becoming Secretary of State, and his combination of personal warmth, legal precision, and political shrewdness made him an ideal negotiator for the complexities of the German question. The key concession that Baker and Bush made to secure Soviet agreement was the assurance, given in conversations but not written into the formal treaties, that NATO would not expand eastward beyond a reunified Germany. This assurance, and its implications for subsequent NATO enlargement, remains one of the most contested issues in post-Cold War diplomacy, with Russia arguing that the assurance was given and broken, and Western officials arguing that no binding commitment was ever made. Whatever the legal and historical truth of this dispute, it reflects the inevitable tensions of a process in which the Soviet Union was essentially negotiating the terms of its strategic withdrawal from Central Europe while still a superpower, albeit a declining one. The economic and monetary union of the two Germanys preceded political reunification. On July 1, 1990, the Deutsche Mark was introduced in East Germany at a 1-to-1 exchange rate with the East Mark for most transactions, a rate that most economists considered wildly overvalued, and that had the immediate effect of making East German industry almost completely uncompetitive. The economic consequences of this decision, essentially adopting West German wage levels and costs while East German productivity remained far below Western standards, were enormous and are still being felt in some respects decades later. Large swathes of East German industry collapsed almost overnight, unable to compete with Western goods now that the protection of the Iron Curtain had been removed. Unemployment rose dramatically. Hundreds of thousands of East Germans who had been employed in unproductive state enterprises found themselves without work in a market economy they had had no experience of. The social and psychological costs were significant, producing what some East Germans called the feeling of being colonized by the West. The formal political reunification of Germany came on October 3, 1990, when the German Democratic Republic was dissolved and its territory acceded to the Federal Republic of Germany under Article 23 of the Basic Law. The Basic Law was extended to cover all of Germany, though with modifications that took account of the specific circumstances of reunification. The GDR's 5 states, Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia, were reconstituted as West German-style federal states, Länder, and became the newest additions to the Federal Republic. Berlin was reunified and eventually became the capital of United Germany again, with the federal government completing its move from Bonn to Berlin in 1999. October 3rd is now observed as German Unity Day, the national holiday of the Federal Republic. Helmut Kohl became the first Chancellor of unified Germany and won the first all-German election in December 1990 on a wave of national emotion and personal popularity that his earlier career had never quite achieved. He served until 1998, when he was defeated by Gerhard Schröder in an election that reflected East German voters' disillusionment with the economic consequences of reunification rather than any rejection of unity itself. Kohl's achievement in navigating the diplomatic and political complexities of reunification is generally regarded as the greatest of his long career, though he was later dogged by a party financing scandal that damaged his historical reputation. He died in June 2017 at the age of 87, having received a European state funeral attended by leaders from across the continent, a ceremony that would have been inconceivable in the dark days of 1945, when Germany lay in ruins and the decision about how to divide it was being made in conference rooms in Yalta and Potsdam. The story of how Germany came to be divided and how it eventually came together again is ultimately a story about human decisions made under conditions of enormous uncertainty, conflicting interests, and ideological antagonism. The men who gathered at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Truman, Atlee, were not dealing with abstract geopolitical problems. They were managing the aftermath of a catastrophe that had killed tens of millions of people, had unleashed previously unimaginable weapons, and had left half a continent physically destroyed. The decisions they made were shaped by their personalities, their experiences, their ideologies, and their calculations about what the future held, and they made those decisions with imperfect information, under time pressure, and with their own ambitions and fears colouring every calculation. Some of those decisions look remarkably wise in retrospect. Others look like catastrophic mistakes. Most look simply like the best available choices among a range of deeply imperfect options. What is remarkable, looking back at the entire arc of the story, is that the division ended as peacefully as it did. The Berlin Wall came down not with guns, but with hammers and popular pressure. The Soviet Union withdrew from Eastern Germany not because it was defeated in battle, but because its own internal contradictions and the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev produced a willingness to accept what could not be prevented. The reunification of Germany was accomplished through diplomacy, not war. This outcome was not inevitable. There were moments, the Berlin blockade, the construction of the wall, the various Khrushchev ultimatums, when the division could have turned violent, could have escalated into the nuclear confrontation that was the deepest fear of everyone involved. That it did not is partly a matter of luck, partly a testament to the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons, and partly a credit to the men and women on all sides who, even in the depths of the Cold War's antagonism, maintained enough contact with reality to step back from the brink. The Germany that emerged from this story is a country that has worked hard to understand how all of this happened and to ensure it never happens again. German schools teach the history of the Nazi period with a candour and depth that is without parallel anywhere in the world. German law prohibits Holocaust denial and the display of Nazi symbols. German politicians across the political spectrum affirm the responsibility of the German state to remember and to ensure that the victims are never forgotten. The country has invested enormously in memorial sites, in archives, in educational programs, and in the ongoing work of documentation and prosecution. Germany's role in European integration, in the development of what became the European Union, reflects a conscious decision by its leaders and its people that the best guarantee against the return of the nationalisms that twice destroyed the continent is to build institutions that make those nationalisms increasingly irrelevant. Whether that project ultimately succeeds is a question that the present generation is still answering. But the journey from the rubble of 1945 through the division of 1949 through the fall of the wall in 1989 to the unified democratic European Germany of today is one of the most extraordinary transformations in modern history. And it began with those conversations in conference rooms in Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam, where a small number of very powerful, very human and very flawed individuals sat down to decide the fate of 80 million people and, in doing so, helped shape the world we still live in. The European Advisory Commission, whose obscure deliberations in Lancaster House in 1944 drew the maps that became the occupation zones, was dissolved in 1945 after completing its work. Its members returned to their various careers. John Wynant, the American representative, was appointed as the American executive on the Allied Control Council and then as ambassador at large before he died by suicide in November 1947, his death attributed to depression and financial difficulties and mourned by those who knew him as one of the most decent men to have served American diplomacy. Sir William Strang was promoted to Permanent Undersecretary of the Foreign Office, the top position in British diplomacy, and served in that role until 1953, his work on the German question earning him little public recognition, but considerable respect among those who understood what had been accomplished. Fedor Gusev returned to Moscow and continued his diplomatic career, eventually becoming Deputy Foreign Minister, his years in London giving him an understanding of Western thinking that was unusual among senior Soviet officials. The Allied Control Council's building in Berlin still stands, a monument to the brief period when the four powers genuinely attempted, however imperfectly and unsuccessfully, to govern Germany together. It is now used by the Berlin courts. The Cecilienhof Palace at Potsdam, where the decisive conference was held, is now a museum and hotel. Its rooms restored to approximately their conference period appearance. The round table at which Truman, Stalin, Churchill and Atlee sat preserved for visitors who want to stand in the place where history pivoted. The Levadia Palace in Crimea, where Roosevelt made his final great diplomatic effort, has had a more complicated history given Crimea's subsequent trajectory, but it too remains a reminder of the moment when a few people's choices shaped the lives of millions. The four occupation zones of 1945 that gave way to two German states in 1949, that gave way to one unified German state in 1990, are one of the great stories of the modern world. A story of war and aftermath, of ideology and pragmatism, of human rights denied and eventually imperfectly restored. The men who decided how Germany would be divided were not gods. They were politicians and soldiers and diplomats doing their best, and sometimes their worst, in circumstances of historic complexity. Roosevelt dreamed of a world order that his health and his life did not allow him to build. Churchill understood the dangers of Soviet power before almost anyone else in Western leadership, but could not prevent his country's exhaustion from limiting its ability to act on that understanding. Stalin pursued Soviet security with a ruthlessness that secured his short-term objectives, while ultimately undermining the system he was protecting. Truman faced the most consequential decisions of the post-war world with inadequate preparation but considerable courage, and got enough of the big ones right. The lesser figures, Clay, Marshall, Burns, Adenauer, Ehrhard, Brandt, Kohl, each made their contributions at their moments, and the story could not have been told without any of them. The Germany that exists today, the Federal Republic whose basic law has now governed it for more than 75 years, is proof that even from the deepest catastrophe, renewal is possible. The division of Germany was not, in the end, the permanent verdict on German history that it sometimes seemed to be during the Cold War's darkest decades. It was a chapter, a long, painful, costly chapter, that eventually turned. And the question of who decided how Germany would be divided is, in the end, less important than the question of who decided to put it back together. The demonstrators in Leipzig on October 9th, 1989, the East Berliners who streamed through the wall on November 9th, and the millions of ordinary Germans on both sides of the border who had never stopped believing, however improbably, that their story was not finished. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that the remarkable story of how Germany came to be divided from the wartime conferences of Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam through the Berlin blockade and the construction of the wall all the way to the extraordinary events of 1989 and 1990 has given you a new appreciation of just how much the world's present was shaped by choices made in the past. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our other videos on the personalities and events of the Second World War and its aftermath. There is so much more to discover, from the fate of Germany's field marshals and generals to the lives of those who survived and rebuilt in the ruins of the Third Reich. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest World War II content. See you in the next one.